The one-drop rule. Black by law. Lawrence Otis Graham, Our Kind of People, Inside America's Black Upper Class, page 1. Brian Gumbel is, but Bill Cosby isn't. Lena Horne is, but Whitney Houston isn't. Andrew Young is, but Jesse Jackson isn't. And neither is Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, Clarence Thomas, or Quincy Jones. And even though both of them try extremely hard, neither Diana Ross nor Robin Givens will ever be. All my life, for as long as I can remember, I grew up thinking that there existed only two types of black people. Those who passed the brown paper bag and ruler test, and those who didn't. Those who were members of the black elite, and those who weren't. Lawrence Otis Graham, Our Kind of People, Inside America's Black Upper Class, page 4. There were those families that made what some called a handsome picture, of people with good hair, wavy or straight, with nice complexions, light brown to nearly white, with sharp features, thin nose, thin lips, sharp jaw, and curiously non-negroid hazel, green, or blue eyes. And there were those that didn't. I had a precious few of the above, while many I knew and played with were able to check off all the right boxes. In fact, I knew some who not only had complexions 10 shades lighter than that brown paper bag and hair as straight as any ruler, but also had multiple generations of good looks, wealth, and accomplishment. And of course, I also knew some black kids who could claim nothing at all. It was a color thing and a class thing. And for generations of black people, color and class have been inexorably tied together. Since I was born and raised around people with a focus on many of these characteristics, it should be no surprise that I was later to decide at age 26 to have my nose surgically altered just so that I could further buy into the aesthetic biases that many among the black elite hold so dear. Franklin E. Frazier, Black Bourgeoisie, page 6. There is, however, an important aspect of the development of the new Negro middle class that might have been included in this book and certainly could not be omitted from a more detailed study. It is strange that the omission was overlooked by American critics, but suggested in a foreign review. I'm referring to the most recent accessions to the Negro middle classes, who are prominent in the sit-ins and in the other protest movements against racial segregation. They do not have the same social background as the black bourgeoisie, in my study, who represent a fusion of the peasant and the gentleman. Although they have been influenced to some extent by the genteel tradition, on the whole, their social background is essentially that of Negro folk. Very seldom can they or their parents claim ancestors among the mixed blood aristocracy which was free before the Civil War. Franklin E. Frazier, Black Bourgeoisie, page 20. In this segregated world, especially in the cities, a class structure slowly emerged which was based upon social distinctions, such as education and conventional behavior, rather than upon occupation and income. At the top of the social pyramid, there was a small upper class. The superior status of this class was due chiefly to its differentiation from the great mass of the Negro population because of a family heritage which resulted partially from its mixed ancestry. The family heritage consisted of traditions of civilized behavior and economic efficiency. The members' light skin color was indicative not only of their white ancestry, but of their descent from the Negroes who were free before the Civil War, or those who had enjoyed the advantages of having served in the houses of their masters. This upper class consistently incorporated those Negroes who were able to acquire an education in the schools supported by Northern philanthropy. The members of the upper class depended on a number of skilled occupations for a living, though there was a sprinkling of teachers, doctors, educated ministers, and small businessmen among them. It is important to understand that Yephethic Negroes and Negresses come in all shades, as do we. We should not judge people or make assumptions according to their appearance or lineage, but only by their behavior. Anyone that accepts the Father and the Son, Yahuwah our Elohim and Yahusha our Messiah, and decides to live by his Torah and in peace and harmony with us, we should accept. However, it is important to understand that there is a distinction between us and them. Not all Yephethic Negroes and Negresses are part of the black elite, the bourgeoisie, or the boule. Not all of them are stumbling blocks that try to derail and undermine our fight for restoration. In this world, the overwhelming majority of societies and cultures are patriarchal in structure and function. They have been this way since ancient times. In these patriarchal societies, the most common way to determine a person's national, tribal, clan, and family memberships is through patrilineal descent. Little, if any, consideration is paid to the mother's origins. If a man and a woman of different national origins marry and have offspring, the offspring would be considered to belong to the man's national, tribal, clan, and family groups.
In many cultures, surnames are passed from father to child. I am a MacLysett because my father, my father's father, and my father's grandfather were MacLyssetts. Unfortunately, my many female ancestors don't get recorded, and in fact, I don't even know my great-grandmother's maiden names.
But isn't it interesting that the way that the Y DNA haplogroup passes down from father to son corresponds precisely with the traditional notion of patrilineality? That is the kinship system in which the family membership, notions of kinship and family membership are derived from father to son and passed on in this way. And that women, when they marry into a new family, join a new family. That is not only the case with the ancient Hebrews in the Bible, but also with the Proto-Indo-Europeans and with all Indo-European groups and all Semitic groups and in many other kinds of cultures. In fact, patrilineality is the common rule among humanity, with some exceptions in more matriarchal systems, but these are rare. Patrilineality associates the passing on of a name in patronymics, sometimes, or the passing on of wealth, property, land, even slaves, wives, all kinds of things are passed down. In a spiritual sense, the family name was always seen as, or rather the family line was always seen in Indo-European cultures, such as Roman, as going through the father's line. And now science has shown us that we can trace this in a way exactly as the old oral cultures did, through that male line. They would have done in Icelandic sagas, they say this man's son of this man's son, just as the Hebrews in the Bible say, Isaac begat Abraham, whatever, this kind of thing. Well, these different cultures all showed a very great concern with being able to prove your line through the father back a long way. They didn't really concern themselves with all the different women they married along the way, and nor does the Y haplogroup. It doesn't show you that. If these ancient cultures thought that the most important aspect of descent was the male line, and if you feel the same way they did, then in that case, your Y haplogroup is very important, because that's precisely what it shows.
The following is a short clip from Ivy Anita's channel here on YouTube. This clip is from the video titled Culture Vultures. Our culture is in a costume. Here, Ivy Anita, an Isan woman, explains how parental lineage and tribal membership works in Nigeria.
Before going on is what I have to say. I do want to say that I am not Igbo, not from my mother's side, not from my father's side, okay? I am an Isan girl, and my mom is Urobo, so I am an Isan/Urobo girl. They are not one of the popular tribes, so you probably have never heard of it. I know you guys know of the Igbos, the Yorubas, the Hausas. You guys have heard of all of that, but they are like many others, okay? And yeah. Your girl here is an Isan girl /Urobo. I always have to add it. I claim the two. Just so you guys understand, when I say I claim the two, I'm just supposed to say I'm an Isan girl, okay? Because in Nigeria, you are from your dad's tribe. Whatever tribe your dad is from, that's where you are from. So when they ask you, oh, what tribe are you? I'm just supposed to say I'm Isan. But I say I'm Isan and Urobo. I'm the two. I just cannot not claim my mom's tribe, okay? Because I'm the two, I beg.
For they are not all Yasharal who are among Yasharal. In the book of Romans, chapter 9, verse 6, the Greek word ek, translated as of, can also be translated as among. When done so, the verse reads as, however, it is not as though the word of Elohim has failed, for they are not all Yasharal who are among Yasharal. The sentence continues on in verse 7. Neither are they all children because they are the seed of Abraham, but in Yitzhak your seed shall be called. By translating ek as the word among instead of the word of, creates harmony in the passage. We can see that verse 7 is not speaking about all of Abraham's descendants, but only the children of Yasharal. Remember, Ishmael was Yitzhak's half-brother, but Ishmael wasn't chosen. The seed of promise would come through Yitzhak's line. Verses 8 through 13 reiterates this point by making a distinction between Yaakov, who is Yasharal, and Esau, his brother. The book of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 24 to 30. Another parable he put before them, saying, the rain of the heavens has become like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed darnel among the wheat and went away. And when the blade sprouted and bore fruit, then the darnel also appeared. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? From where then does it have the darnel? And he said to them, A man, an enemy, did this. And the servants said to him, Do you wish then that we go and gather them up? But he said, No, lest while you gather up the darnel, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of the harvest I shall say to the reapers, First gather the darnel and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my granary. The book of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 36 to 34. Then, having sent the crowds away, Yahusha went into the house, and his taught ones came to him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the darnel of the field. And he answering said to them, He who is sowing the good seed is the son of Adam, and the field is the world. And the good seed, these are the sons of the rain, but the darnel are the sons of the wicked one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. And the harvest is the end of this age. The son of Adam shall send out his messengers, and they shall gather out of his reign all the stumbling blocks, and those doing lawlessness, and shall throw them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous shall shine forth as the sun in the reign of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 21. Yet I had planted you a choice vine, all of it a true seed. How then have you turned before me into the degenerate plant of a strange vine? Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 27 to 28. See, the days are coming, declares Yahuwah, that I shall sow the house of Yasharal and the house of Yehudah with the seed of man and the seed of beast. And it shall be that as I have watched over them to pluck up, and to break down, and to throw down, and to destroy, and to afflict, I shall watch over them to build and to plant, declares Yahuwah. Agricultural terms as euphemisms for sex. Semen, seed, sowing your wild oats. Semen, noun, a viscous whitish fluid of the male reproductive tract consisting of spermatozoa suspended in secretions of accessory glands, as of the prostate and Cowper's glands. Etymology, Middle English, from Latin, seed, semen, akin to Old High German, samo, seed, Latin, to sow. To sow your wild oats. The wild oat, formal name Avena fatua, is a grass species native to Eurasia, which has for centuries been called wild oats in English. Similar in appearance to the useful cereal grain Avena sativa, also known as the common or domestic oat. Wild oats are an invasive weed. Its seeds often get mixed in with the seeds of the domestic oat, and is hard to separate when sowing because of its similar look. Wild oats damage fields by drying them out and reducing the mineral content of the soil, which reduces the crop yields of wheat and domestic oat. They also serve as a fungal vector, which damages the useful cereal grains. The saying to sow wild oats or to sow your wild oats has two meanings. 1. The pursuit of unfruitful endeavors that waste time, effort, and resources. 2. When a young man carelessly sleeps with women that he has no intentions of marrying, which often result in the birth of an unwanted child, a wild oat.
Once two youngins go down the hill to the dollhouse where Master Kilpatrick's children are playing. They want to go into the dollhouse when one of Mr. Kilpatrick's boys say, "This here for white folk children." They say, "We ain't no niggers. We got the same daddy you has, and he comes to see us nearly every day and fetches us clothes and things from town. They just a fussing, and Mrs. Kilpatrick is listening to them out her chamber window. She heard them white niggers say, 'He our daddy. We call him daddy when he comes to our house to see our mama.'"
Madison Grant, The Passing of the Great Race or the Racial Basis of European History, pages 15 to 16. It must be borne in mind that the specializations which characterize the higher races are of relatively recent development, are highly unstable, and when mixed with general or primitive characters, tend to disappear. Whether we like to admit it or not, the result of the mixture of two races in the long run gives us a race reverting to the more ancient, generalized, and lower type. The cross between a white man and an Indian is an Indian. The cross between a white man and a Negro is a Negro. The cross between a white man and a Hindu is a Hindu. And the cross between any of the three European races and a Jew is a Jew. Madison Grant, The Passing of the Great Race, or the Racial Basis of European History, pages 73 to 74. Look at any group of Negroes in America. It is easy to see that while they are essentially Negroes, whether coal black, brown, or yellow, the great majority of them have varying amounts of Nordic blood in them. which has modified their physical structure without transforming them in any way into white men. This miscegenation was, of course, a frightful disgrace to the dominant race, but its effects on the Nordics have been negligible for the simple reason that it was confined to white men crossing with Negro women, and not the reverse process, which would, of course, have resulted in the infusion of Negro blood into the American stock. James Oliver Horton and Lois E. Horton, Slavery and the Making of America, page 30. By the 1660s, the Chesapeake colonies began establishing the legal foundation for racial distinctions that created the formal structure for 18th century racial slavery. Colonial Virginia authorities formulated regulations to stabilize the emerging slave system in a way that worked to the advantage of slaveholders. Under traditional English common law, a child took the father's status. In 1662, Virginia changed the law to allow status to travel through the maternal line, so that children produced by unions between slave women and their free white masters would be slaves, not free. Thus, Englishmen could increase the supply of perpetual servants and more easily maintain the racial distinction between slave and free, enslaving their own children. Michelle Gordon Jackson, Light, Bright, and Damn Near White, pages 4 to 7. As historian J.C. Furness points out, these near-white slaves were often auctioned off at a higher price because of their use as sexual objects. The mulatto slave woman approximated the white ideal of feminine beauty, and yet she was property and had no rights. And though female slaves, regardless of color, were raped, Furness says, the mulatto afforded the slave owner the opportunity to rape with impunity a woman who was physically white or near white, but legally black. Hence, slave children continue to be born whiter and whiter. Reverend Francis Hawley of Connecticut said in 1839, "It is so common for the female slaves to have white children that little or nothing is ever said about it." Michelle Gordon Jackson, Light, Bright, and Damn Near White, page 13. Historians have cited various reasons as to why the war began, including economic reasons due to the invention of the cotton gin, strife between slaves versus free states, and the fight between federal versus states' rights. But Lawrence R. Tenzer, author of The Forgotten Cause of the Civil War, A New Look at the Slavery Issue, proposes that one of the fundamental causes of the American Civil War had to do with these mulatto slaves that fit into the one-drop rule construct. Runaways like these referenced in the newspaper ads became an increasing threat to the white free population in the North. Tenzer relays that because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, runaways could be recaptured and sent back into slavery. He says that the chance that some northern whites could be mistaken for these runaways and forced into slavery gradually led to a psychological undercurrent of an ongoing threat. The potential of being claimed as one of these white-looking runaways was on the minds of many white Northerners. This contributed to the increased urgency on the part of those in the North to end slavery in the South. Lawrence Otis Graham, Our Kind of People, Inside America's Black Upper Class, page 7. Not surprisingly, both whites and house niggers came to consider the dark-skinned field niggers to be less civilized and intellectually inferior. Since many white slave owners established clandestine and forced sexual relations with their female house slaves, the mulatto offspring, who were also assigned slave status, extended the size of the house slave staff. In fact, it was to the owner's benefit to mate with as many of these female slaves as possible, for each child was a new slave. While none of these illegitimate offspring had any more rights than the unmixed African slaves, they became a part of a growing phenomenon of lighter complexioned house slaves who separated themselves even further from the field blacks. It is evident that the fixation on skin color by both upper-class whites and blacks derives from the fact that light-skinned blacks were given a favored status by white slave owners from their very early interaction during the slavery period, explains Professor Alexander. Henry Louis Gates and Cornel West, The Future of the Race, page 18. Not long after I arrived at Yale, some of the brothers who came from private schools in New Orleans held a bag party. As a classmate explained it to me, a bag party was a New Orleans custom wherein a brown paper bag was stuck on the door and anyone darker than it was denied entrance. Franklin E. Frazier, Black Bourgeoisie, pages 13 to 14. The close association of the races on the plantation, especially in the same household, resulted in considerable race mixture. The interbreeding of the races had begun the 17th century soon after the introduction of Negroes into Virginia, and continued on a large scale as long as slavery existed. Many of the mulattoes were emancipated by their white fathers and formed the basis of the free Negro population that grew up in the South before the Civil War. In 1850, mulattoes or mixed bloods constituted 37% of the free Negro population, but only 8% of the slave population. In Charleston, South Carolina, and in New Orleans, the free Negroes or free people of color accumulated considerable wealth as skilled artisans and as owners of plantations, included slaves among their possessions. James Oliver Horton and Lois E. Horton, Slavery and the Making of America, pages 198 to 199. Blacks continued to serve in the militia even after Louisiana became a part of the United States, forming a black military unit commanded by black officers called the Louisiana Native Guard. As one New Orleans newspaper reminded its readers, many of those who volunteered to serve in the Native Guard in the 1860s were the descendants of those who had served with Andrew Jackson and defended the city at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. When Louisiana seceded from the United States in January 1861, hundreds of free black men joined the Native Guard and offered their services. The reasons they were willing to serve in the Louisiana militia were varied and complex. Most of the men were prosperous, well-educated New Orleans men of mixed European and African heritage. In New Orleans, 80% of free people of color were of mixed ancestry, compared with only 10% in the rest of the state. Their light complexion elevated their status over darker blacks, particularly in the eyes of Louisiana whites, and gave them a unique opportunity to prosper. This created a mulatto class in New Orleans connected to many white slave-holding families by kinship. A few of these wealthy mulattoes even held slaves. James Oliver Horton and Lois E. Horton, Slavery and the Making of America, page 199. Although there were a number of African American slaveholders throughout the South by 1860, almost all held friends, spouses, and relatives in nominal bondage because state laws either prohibited emancipation, made it difficult, or required free blacks to leave the state. By contrast, some of the African American slaveholders in Louisiana, and particularly in New Orleans, employed slave labor on large flourishing plantations or in fine city homes. As one free man of color, a wealthy New Orleans wine merchant, explained his willingness to fight for Louisiana, he feared reprisal and loss of his property should he not show loyalty to the state's defense. The Native Guard received an ambivalent reception from white Louisianans. In early 1862, the Louisiana legislature declared the militia open only to white men and officially disbanded the Native Guard. James Oliver Horton and Lois E. Horton, Slavery in the Making of America, page 199. In the spring, U.S. troops under the command of General Benjamin Butler entered New Orleans, forcing Confederate troops to evacuate the city. Slaves flocked to the Federal forces and labored for the army at such tasks as building fortifications, washing clothes, and repairing and maintaining buildings and equipment. At one point, the 12th Connecticut Infantry had 40 black women doing laundry and other domestic work. Butler, who had vowed never to recruit black soldiers, found himself in need of fighters. As the Confederates attacked Baton Rouge just to the north and threatened New Orleans, when the Confederate forces had withdrawn, the African American militia had refused to leave the city. Instead, they had offered their services to the U.S. Army, and by the late summer of 1862, Butler accepted their offer. "I shall have within 10 days," Butler wrote in late August, "a regiment of 1,000 strong of native guards, colored." The general seemed pleased that his African American troops were composed of free black men, the darkest of whom is about the complexion of the late Mr. Daniel Webster, former U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. Franklin E. Frazier, Black Bourgeoisie, page 12. While all the slaves were always under the surveillance of whites, the house servants lived constantly in close association with their masters. Very often, these house servants had associated from childhood with their masters. Consequently, they early acquired the speech of their masters, a fact which set them off from the more isolated field hands who spoke a dialect. Living in close association with whites, the house servants were subject to a type of discipline which caused them to identify themselves with their masters. This discipline included both moral and religious instruction. The slaves participated in the religious life of their white masters, including family prayers and attendance at the white churches, where a section was reserved for them. Franklin E. Frazier, Black Bourgeoisie, pages 14 to 15. The free Negroes constituted, in fact, the element in the Negro population that had made the greatest progress in acquiring European culture. The pattern of life of the well-to-do free Negroes in the plantation South was the same as the patriarchal family pattern of the slaveholding whites. Moreover, their outlook on life and their values were the same as the white models. They occupied the position of an intermediate caste in some parts of the South, especially in New Orleans. As a group, the free Negroes of the South were much better off economically than the free Negroes of the North, who had not been able to compete with the European immigrants. At one time, the free Negroes in the South outnumbered the free Negroes in the North, but as a result of persecutions following the anti-slavery agitation in the North, many of them migrated to the North. Nevertheless, half of the nearly 500,000 free Negroes in the United States at the outbreak of the Civil War were in the South. Franklin E. Frazier, Black Bourgeoisie, page 31. It was only in Louisiana, where under French rule, a considerable class of free mulattoes, or gens de couleur, had become important. That free Negroes owned large plantations ranged from 40,000 to 200,000, and they had from 40 to 100 slaves. Among the taxpayers in Charleston, South Carolina in 1860, there were listed 371 free persons of color, including 13 Indians who paid taxes on real estate valued at about $1 million and 389 slaves. In New Orleans, where the free Negroes, or gens de couleur, were better off economically and socially than in other parts of the South, their holdings in real estate and slaves were estimated to be from $10 to $15 million in 1860.
So you know how we be kikiing that there's a difference between white mama biracials and black mama biracials, right? This is an actual sociological phenomenon that I really think we could trace back to slavery. Stay with me.
There are many documented instances of liaisons between slave women and white men that produced offspring. Sometimes these offspring were claimed by the father, and that potentially provided a pathway to being recognized as a free person with more rights than a slave would have.
The free people of color did in fact occupy a legal status. It was sort of a third tier between the upper class whites and the petty blancs and then the slaves. So they did in fact have some recognized rights as a class of people, as opposed to just simply being black with some privileges because they were freed.
There were free people of color who owned slaves. There were a number of planters who were free people of color, who were the children of white planters, who inherited the plantation, inherited the slaves, and acted much like any other plantation owner. There were free people of color who owned slaves. There were a number of planters who were free people of color, who were the children of white planters, who inherited the plantation, inherited the slaves, and acted much like any other plantation owner.
The reality in Saint-Domingue was that you did in fact have these recognized groups, each having some privileges, and they really were not melded together. There was distance between free people of color and the slaves. You had some extremely well-off free people of color in the Caribbean colonies, and they certainly did not want to be identified with slaves. They didn't want to be identified in any case with Africans. They considered themselves to be as free, and since many of them were educated, as good as their white counterparts. And so you did have that separation.
Once two youngins go down the hill to the dollhouse where Master Kilpatrick's children are playing. They want to go into the dollhouse when one of Mr. Kilpatrick's boys say, "This here for white folk children." They say, "We ain't no niggers. We got the same daddy you have. And he comes to see us nearly every day and fetches us clothes and things from town. They just a fussing, and Mrs. Kilpatrick is listening to them out her chamber window. She heard them white niggas say, 'He our daddy. We call him daddy when he comes to our house to see our mama.'"
What your dad is what your features may take more on. If you notice, people with black fathers and white mothers look different than people with white fathers and black mothers. They don't look the same at all.
I don't even know. I don't know that
You
part.
can get somebody that has a black father and a white mother more mixed up with a light-skinned, full black man, versus if you look at somebody that has a white dad and a black mom, you can clearly distinct that this is somebody that's black and white.
There I went to with my mom, and we were in the parking lot leaving, And my mom like honked her horn because the woman was taking a long time to like figure out how to get out. And the woman turned around and screamed the N-word at my mom. I just remember my mom, like, I remember the grip that her hands had on the steering wheel. And like you could see it was so tight where like the knuckles get all white. And she was just silent the rest of the drive home. We'd never talked about it. I'd never in my life heard someone say the N-word. Very different to be a minority but not be treated as a minority right off the bat. But obviously now people are very aware of my race because they made it such an issue when I went to the UK. But before that, most people didn't treat me like a black woman. So that talk didn't have to happen for me.
As a parent, in hindsight, absolutely, I would like to go back and have that kind of real conversation about how the world sees you.
Who is teaching their child about blackness? About black culture? Who? My biracial child realize they're black. So again, who is telling this child about their blackness?
Black men get unfairly blamed for this, but black men did not fight for the legalization of interracial marriage. Black women and white men did. We never had any power over instituting miscegenation laws or tearing them down. Yephethic Negroes and Negresses belong to the people and nations of their parental line, and we belong to the people and nation of our parental line.